Hello, everyone. Today we'll be talking about Nadler's and Shapiro's chapter on thinking, good and bad. Let us begin. So something that neither Nadler nor Shapiro discuss in his chapter, though I think it's often in the minds of intellectual level students, people have not really been thinking about this for a long time, though it is pretty much in the social air, is the thought that people have a right to believe whatever they want to believe. And there's a sense in which that is obviously correct. But oftentimes, that sense of have a right to believe whatever I want to believe might become an obstacle for understanding the kinds of lessons that Shapiro and Nadler are trying to put forth about what it is to think responsibly and what it is to think well. So I want to make it explicit. Again, in the text, this was not explicit. They did not address this distinction, but I want to address it because my experience as a teacher leads me to believe that a lot of students have this in the back of their mind, and it becomes kind of an impediment or an obstacle, or they think an objection to the points happening in the text. So anyway, what do we mean when we say I have a right to believe what I want to believe? What means historically, at least in the classical liberal model, political model that we inhabit, is that it's a political right. So that's the first point here. It's a political right. What does it mean for something to be a political right? Well, in this particular case, it means that it is wrong or unjust for others on the basis of personal beliefs, what I want to believe, to deprive one of political rights. So things like the ability to vote, the ability to hold political office, the ability to own property, to work, and so on. The kinds of political benefits that come with being a part of a relatively well-functioning society. People have rights to these things, at least in principle. In a good governmental structure ensures those rights to the extent that it is possible. So to have the right to believe what one wants to believe historically has been understood in this political sense. The right is a political right. In other words, if I believe that the earth is flat, if I believe in particular religion, and if I believe, things that other people might disagree with me, I have a right to believe that. But what that means is that I can still own property, I can still work, I can still hold political office, and so on. My personal beliefs should not interfere with my ability to enjoy the political benefits of being part of society. That's what it is to have a political right to believe what wants to believe. And the first observation I want to make is that that seems right. It seems that if you look at the history of, politics and governmental structures and the way in which societies have structured themselves, having political rights like this one is one of the great advantages of modern civilization. It is a good thing that we have political rights like that. However, crucially, that none of this implies or means that my having the right to believe something, a political right, means that what I believe is reasonable, it's correct, or is likely to be true. I can still be a very bad thinker and have the political right to believe what I believe. Those are separate questions. Whether in my believing something, I'm doing so justifiably with reasons, I'm doing so well. That's the question that concerns us. That's the question for philosophy. That's the topic of this chapter, not whether or not that should be connected to a political right. We should have the political right, but that does not mean that I have the right to say make my beliefs reasonable. That like have no such right? That makes no sense. Or I just believing and making what I believe to be true. Like that makes no sense. Political rights simply do not entail that what individual personal beliefs hold is true. Like political rights just do not entail truth, reasonableness, or correctness of beliefs. Those are separate topics. And it is the second topic that is the subject for today. So let's move into the text. The text advocates taking responsibility for beliefs, something that might sound strange. We're used to hearing things like taking responsibility for behaviors or taking responsibility for the shape of your life, for the kind of person you are. So in those contexts about talking about personal characters, about personalities, or about particular actions, we're used to talking about people inviting us to take responsibility or holding us accountable for the kinds of persons that we are and the kinds of actions that we believe. That makes sense. But about beliefs, I think that's a lot rarer. We rarely talk about taking responsibility for our beliefs. Is the topic for us. And here's a kind of very brief argument to the effect that this is perfectly reasonable. So people's beliefs influence their behavior. We believe some things and then we act on the basis of the beliefs. Beliefs help us navigate the world, help us make sense of our surroundings. And then we act on the basis of those interpretations of the world that are colored by, that are influenced by our beliefs. So personal beliefs, human beliefs influence the way we interact in the world, we act in the world. And of course, we are responsible for the way we act in the world. So now we are responsible or accountable for the way we engage in the world. So it kind of follows very quickly that we're responsible for the way we believe, precisely because it is embedded in this process of acting in the world. Believing is essentially connected to interpreting reality, which leads to action. So we're responsible not only for what we do, but for how we think, which leads to how we do. Anyway, that's pretty straightforward. Here's a cool quote from Clifford, one of the early champions of taking responsibility for one's beliefs. He writes, "Every time we let ourselves believe for unworthy reasons, we weaken our powers of self-control, of doubting, by which we really mean something like critical thinking, in judiciary and fair weighing of the relevant evidence." In other words, part of taking responsibility for our beliefs involves developing a particular character, a particular intellectual character, a particular way of thinking about the world, and we become better at it. So if we are intra-scientific enterprise, for example, the more we start doing the science, the more we realize what it is to do good science versus bad science. And the more we start acting on the basis of good scientific thinking, the better scientists we become, and so on. Clever self-preservation is that we form patterns, we become kinds of people, and that involves thinking practices as well. So we are responsible to others because we're embedded in a society, but we are responsible to ourselves to become better thinkers because that forms the kind of character that we have. And we can become clumsy and bad at it, or we can develop our ability to think better. That's its main observation. Therefore, we're responsible to. We owe it to ourselves to think better. He provides what he takes to be a very powerful example. So this is an example of a ship owner. He owns a ship. He sends cargo. He's a merchant, but the ship is relatively old. He starts to worry that it might not be seaworthy. In other words, he starts to worry that it might be too old and it might not make it across the sea. So doubts start creeping in. He starts thinking, oh, maybe I should have it thoroughly checked, perhaps remodeled, perhaps you put a decent amount of resources into it, so make sure that everyone in the ship is safe. But he doesn't like that because that's going to cost a lot of money. So instead of looking at the evidence that shows that the ship is very old, he started looking at the evidence that shows that it is seaworthy. And the evidence says that it has been traveling the sea for many years. So the ship owner focuses on the evidence of the seaworthiness of the ship, namely that it has made the ship many, many times and has come back safe, and overlooks the fact that it's getting very old and decrepit. So he selectively identifies evidence to look at and ignores other relevant evidence. And then he kind of gets himself to believe, he talks himself into believing that the ship is seaworthy precisely by only looking at the evidence that supports that conclusion and ignoring the other evidence. So he lets the ship go. He does a typical trip, or at least he sends people doing a typical trip. Halfway through the trip to the voyage, the ship sinks and people die. And at the end of the scene, we see the ship owner collecting his insurance money. So here's what Clifford thinks, you think, and everyone should think. The ship owner has made a mistake. In fact, has made two mistakes. There's something wrong in the way the ship owner acted. Morally speaking, the ship owner has endangered humans unnecessarily. In fact, it ended in the death of those people. So he's morally culpable. He did something morally wrong. He risked the lives of people unnecessarily for the sake of making money. That's bad. But Clifford points out there's another, in some sense, more fundamental error that led to this second moral error, and that's the error in thinking. The ship owner violated the norms of thinking properly by selectively looking at the evidence that supported the belief he wanted to hold, that the ship was seaworthy, and ignoring the good evidence that it was not seaworthy. So the ship owner's thinking practices of selectively identifying some evidence at the expense of the other and weighing it heavily than he should have is another kind of mistake. It's another kind of transgression. But that's not acting as such, that's believing. So the ship owner, Clifford tells us, is guilty on two accounts. He's guilty of thinking poorly, of violating norms of thinking, and then he's guilty of acting morally wrongly. He's endangering the lives of other people and in fact causing them death. That's the conclusion. We should take responsibility for our actions. And part of taking responsibility for our actions involves taking responsibility for our believing practices, and the case of the ship owner illustrates this very vividly. Let's move on. So the Shapiro and the other author of the book point out that there is this basic pervasive moral epistemic problem with a lot of people in the US. There's this way of thinking that unfortunately is not a good way of thinking, though it's pervasive. And they call this epistemic stubbornness. The basic definition of epistemic stubbornness is something like this. It involves a type of resistance or defiance in the face of reason and evidence. It is manifested in choosing to ignore evidence or choosing to call into question the credibility of the source of the evidence simply because of where it leads. In other words, it's not someone critically assessing the quality of the evidence and then like thinking about which one's more credible than the other. It's someone who already has a belief in mind that they want to hold before looking at the evidence. And then they select their evidence on the basis of which one fits or supports their belief and accepts that evidence, emphasizes that evidence, and or ignores the evidence that is not that. The ship owner is a great example of that. He stubbornly looked at and only at the evidence that supported that belief he wanted, namely to believe that the ship was seaworthy. The problem with epistemic stubbornness is that people that are in the grip of this way of thinking, they're not really after truth. They don't want to know what the world is like. Their beliefs are not there to help them navigate the world accurately. Their beliefs are there for some other reasons, some self-serving reasons that are morally and epistemically problematic. So here's a slightly different way of saying the same thing. Someone who's epistemically stubborn forces facts or evidence into their antecedently held theories instead of the reasonable way of doing things, which is to construct theories on the basis of the facts of the evidence. A good thinker looks at the evidence first before making up their mind, or if they have already a belief, they suspend their belief by looking at the evidence and seeing the extent to which their antecedently held belief actually lines up with the evidence. He who has the belief first and forces the evidence into it is not thinking properly, is in the grip of epistemic stubbornness. So part of the problem of epistemic stubbornness is that it's a bad strategy for attaining truth. That's someone who's doing this is not going to know the world better. They're going to get stuck in whatever they believe, and they're going to have a lot of false beliefs. But part of the problem is also that it spreads. Like all human practices, one does it in a public setting, other people see, they imitate it, and it spreads, right? Human practices spread. So when one is epistemically stubborn, it's likely that what's going to influence other people to also become epistemically stubborn, and soon we're going to have a culture, or at least a subculture of epistemically stubborn people. And that's exactly the point of the chapter, that in fact, we see many subgroups within the US of people that are united by this epistemic stubbornness. And that's just recipe for disaster in all sorts of fronts. So what's the remedy? How do we push against epistemic stubbornness? If epistemic stubbornness is a bad way of thinking, what's a good way of thinking? They call this evidentialism, in most of the chapters dedicated to spelling out what it is to be an evidentialist, or what is to have the pattern of thinking that is evidentialism. Evidentialism is more conducive to truth, therefore it's intellectually virtuous. That's what good reasoners should do. So here's a very brief definition. One ought to believe something only if one has enough evidence for that. So adjust your belief to the evidence that you have, right? That's the basic move. It's very straightforward. And the observation is that it's not just that a recommendation. If you want to have true beliefs, do this. It's a much stronger claim. It's something like, we ought to. There's this normative obligation laid upon our thinking, such that if we fail to comply with it, we're thinking badly, we're believing irresponsibly. So believing without evidence, or even worse, refusing to believe given the evidence, is thinking poorly and irresponsibly. It doesn't attain truth, and it's a recipe for disaster, as we saw with the ship case scenario, but it's generally a recipe for disaster. So again, Clifford ship owner is a good example of this. The point that Shapiro and Nadler made many times is that they're not just talking about what some people do. Like some people reason this way, other people reason other ways. But rather, no, there are good ways of reasoning and bad ways of reasoning, and those are defined relative to the extent to which those give you the truth, right? Good way of reasoning makes it more likely that you attain the truth. A bad way of reasoning or thinking leads you to not attaining the truth, or makes it less likely that you attain the truth. So there's objective criteria for assessing good thinking patterns and bad thinking patterns. And furthermore, there are obligations. Once we notice that there are good and bad thinking patterns, that there are obligations that are laid upon our thinking practices. We ought to behave in the way that complies with good thinking practices. Just like when we realize that punching people in the face is bad, and helping them in the case of catastrophe is good, we thereby inquire the obligation not to punch people in the face, especially for no reason, but in general, and to help people when they're in occasions of calamities and things like that. Recognizing the existence of good versus bad gives rise to the obligation to promote the good and to undermine or do away with the bad. The same happens with epistemic domain. These epistemic obligations are contrasted with moral obligations. That is, the kinds of obligations we have towards others, what we owe to other people. They're also contrasted with potential obligations. These are the kinds of things we owe to ourselves. So that we have obligations towards ourselves, we have obligations towards other people, and we also have obligations for thinking properly. Those are epistemic obligations. Evidentialism is an essential way for us to comply with these epistemic obligations. So the last thing I want to talk about is a crucial distinction that Nadler and Shapiro make about justification versus prudence. So belief is justified if it has enough evidence or reasons to support it, and that makes it more likely to be true. So if one has a belief that is justified, if it's likely to be true, more likely than not. In the way we know that something's more likely to be true than not is because we have enough evidence or reasons to support it. So this kind of naturally follows from evidentialism. Believers should try to have their beliefs be justified. That's the basic claim here. So just to be extra clear, they introduce the notion of epistemic reasons. Epistemic reasons are the kinds of evidence or reasons that increase the likelihood or probability that a belief is true. So what counts as evidence or support of a belief, and for the sake of justification? Well, any kind of consideration that makes it more likely that a belief is true. If one is inquiring, say, in a court of justice, whether the accused is guilty of the crime, the fact that the murder weapon has the fingerprints is an epistemic reason, right? It increases the likelihood that the accused is guilty. Doesn't ensure it, but it's moving in that direction. If we have enough pieces of epistemic reasons, like the fingerprints in the weapon, at some point we'll have enough for just justified belief. In something, again, only counts as an epistemic reason if, in fact, it contributes to the objective probability of the belief in question being true. Just to be extra clear, a belief is true if and only if it describes the way the world is. So, for example, my belief that it is raining is true if and only if it is raining. It's the fact in the world is such that my belief responds to it, describes it in the right way. If I believe it is snowing, but it is sunny, then my belief is not true. It's false, right? It fails to describe the way the world is. If I believe it is raining, and lo and behold, there's rain outside, then my belief is true. Truth is the correlation between my belief and the world, and it's the correlation of accuracy or correspondence. When my belief describes the way the world is, then it is true. If it doesn't, it's not. Epistemic reasons are the ones that make it more likely that my beliefs do, in fact, track the way the world is. So potential reasons are very different. And Shapiro and Nadler point out, hey, there are these things too. They are the kinds of considerations for belief that one endorses because it benefits or it's good for the person that believes those things. And here's an example. My believing that my marriage is a good marriage makes it more likely that my marriage lasts and it thrives and does well. So my belief, so now I have a prudential reason for believing that my marriage is good, namely that if I believe that it is good, it is much more likely that my marriage will thrive. Likewise, if I'm in office hours with a student and the student comes in and they have a confused question, I have a prudential reason for thinking they have something smart to say. They just haven't said it yet. Let me help them spell it out. So why is that prudential reason? Because if I believe that, then I'll say things that will likely bring about the intelligent thing from the students and so on. So those are prudential reasons. The reasons for believing something, but the motivation is some benefit, something good comes about from believing. It's crucial to point out that epistemic reasons and prudential reasons are different. The fact that I have a reason, say, to believe that my marriage is a good one, or that the student has something smart to say, does not give me any epistemic reason whatsoever that it is true, right? That's just a different ground for belief altogether. It's one that has benefits. So I have potential reasons for believing things because it pays off. But that's not epistemic reasons. That's not justification. That's something else. Here's the final point before I conclude. How do prudential reasons and epistemic reasons comes together? It seems that the most reasonable thing to say here is that one can believe on epistemic grounds only when these beliefs do not conflict with epistemic grounds. So one can believe in prudential grounds, sorry, only when that does not conflict with epistemic grounds. So let's go back to the marriage example. I should believe on prudential grounds that I have a good marriage that makes it more likely to thrive. But if I have a lot of evidence of, say, cheating, betrayal, distrust, hatred, and things like that, if I have good epistemic reasons for that, then my belief that my marriage is good is just a foolish one, right? My belief that my marriage is a good one is, in fact, more likely to thrive only when I do have epistemic reasons that do not indicate that that is false. Prudential reasons operate within the boundaries of epistemic reasons. That seems to be the right way of thinking about these things. But anyway, I'll stop here. I'll see you next time.